I just finished this drawing, but this is what it looked like 45 minutes earlier. Can you spot the differences? If I had made the 6th common mistake artists make when drawing portraits, my drawing would be stuck right here. It's good, but it isn't great. And to make great drawings, you need to avoid all 7 of these mistakes. Drawing a portrait is kind of like building a house. Both require a careful planning phase. You wouldn't just start building your dream house right out of your head. You would take some time to really plan it out and make sure it's all going to work together. For a representational portrait, take a moment to think about what you'd like your end result to look like. When I started with this project, I knew that I wanted to create a portrait that was highly rendered. By this, I mean that I was going to be able to use a lot of shading to show the volume on the face. So with this in mind, I knew that I needed a photo reference that had a really clear and direct light source. You already know which photo reference I selected, but now that you can see all the photos that I had to choose from, take a moment and identify why I didn't select the others. There were only 3 with shadow shapes, and I selected this one because it had the most flattering light and had a composition and head position that I was excited to draw. With this planning in place, I'm ready to start my portrait and move on to discussing mistake number 2. After my initial prep work, I start every single portrait with a circle, and then I turn the circle into a sphere by wrapping a couple lines around it, so I now conceptualize this circle as a sphere in 3 dimensions. Is this a new approach for you? It definitely was for me when I started using this, because I was one of those people that loved drawing eyes, but so often the eye would be great and then it just wouldn't fit and work within the rest of the head. And I see this in my student work all the time. Just recently, I had a student build the entire drawing around the lips because she drew the lips so well. But of course, the piece didn't come together. In our house building analogy, you have your plot of land and now it's time to start building your dream house. But where are you going to start? Are you going to start by moving in your bedspread, your beautiful new bed, and all of the artwork you're going to hang on the walls? Of course not. The house doesn't exist yet. You need to start by digging the foundation, building the walls, and understanding where this house exists in space. Then, as you continue to build and finalize your home and install the plumbing and get everything working together, then it's time to decorate. You've got to start with a really structural foundation that allows you to understand the proportions before you come in with details. I'm using a method called the Loomis method, which is a head conceptualization technique created in the 40s by Andrew Loomis. There is a whole book about this, and I made my own video about this technique, and that will all be linked down in the notes below. In his introduction to his book, Drawing the Head and Hands, Andrew Loomis says the big difference between the completely amateur attempt and the well-grounded approach is that the beginner starts by setting eyes, ears, nose, and mouths into blank white space surrounded by some sort of an outline for the face. Okay, I've totally been there. He goes on to say, this is drawing in the 2 dimensions of height and width only. We must somehow get into the 3rd dimension of thickness, which means that we must draw the whole head as it exists in space and build the face upon it. The second mistake that artists make all the time with portraiture is starting with the features rather than starting by conceptualizing the head in 3 dimensions. Colored pencil is such a fun medium to work with when it comes to portraiture because you can inject a ton of color and create different moods and emotions in the portraiture. But colored pencil can be challenging to work with because it's hard to erase and manipulate. And for that reason, everything that I'm teaching you in this video can directly translate into working with graphite, which is a lot easier to move around and change. I did start with a Prismacolor Col-Erase colored pencil, which is an erasable colored pencil. And so I rolled a kneaded eraser over the entire surface to lighten it up so that it's easier to come in and make adjustments with my second layer. And although I'm switching over to a Polychromos colored pencil now, which is a little less erasable, I have several other tricks up my sleeve for fixing colored pencil mistakes, so stick around for those. In my second pass through a portrait, I really like to create some emotional distance between myself and the first layer. And by that I mean, I'm not thinking about all the things that went well and how much I like different parts of the drawing. Rather, I'm thinking about it as if somebody else drew it and it's my job to edit and correct it. So I'm looking through it on this second layer with a very critical eye. I am giving myself permission to move the features around a little bit if I need to. And I'm also focusing on anchoring these features together with shadow shapes. So notice I'm not coming into the eye and drawing the pupil and the iris and the eyelashes, but rather I'm looking at my photo reference and I am focusing on which parts of the photo reference are the darkest. And I am mapping them in. I'm looking very closely at shapes here. And this helps me to get all the features to work together and helps me improve my proportions because it allows me to fill in those other parts of the face, like the forehead and the side of the face and the cheek, with specific shapes that help me measure the distance between the features. And I found this to be a very, very critical part of my drawing process for both getting my proportions right and to start adding value and rendering. I am not coming in, however, with the darkest value that I see in my photo reference. Rather, I'm mapping all these values in really lightly and just beginning to create some contrast. This is another way that you can allow your colored pencil drawing to be very fluid and open so that it can continue to be adaptable as you come in and build the drawing up. I'm really looking for sort of a two-value color scheme here, the white of the paper and this mid-light value of the colored pencil. And I am working as generally as possible. If we go back to that house building analogy, I am working on the structure and the framework and making sure everything is in the right place still. I've got the walls built, but now I'm coming in and adding the plumbing and the electricity and making sure that all parts of the house work together and serve their proper function. I like to stick with one colored pencil here because I'm not then worried about making sure that I'm matching colors while I'm mapping in value. That's a lot to think about, and it's possible, but for beginning and intermediate artists, and even for myself, I prefer to keep things as simple as possible through each step of the process. Up to this point, I've spent about an hour on this drawing, about 30 minutes for that Loomis lay-in and another 30 minutes or so for the value lay-in. So with just an hour, I was able to get a lot of structure in, and I'm able to do this a lot quicker when I work on a smaller scale or when my goal is to have a slightly looser drawing. This is where you want to practice. And what I'm doing right now is the fine detail and rendering. This is much more time consuming, and you don't get as much bang for your buck in your practice here as you do in that initial portrait layout. Practice your block-ins, practice proportions, and practice drawing heads from multiple different angles and really getting the structure in before you start spending more time on rendering. The rendering will come, and this is more of a technique, but the conceptualization and that eye for proportions is going to come in the practice that you have in the first 15 to 20% of your portrait. So do tons and tons of block-ins. Then once you really feel like you've got this skill down, you can begin to play around with rendering portraits with a lot more detail. And as you can see here, I'm still working very generally and then getting more and more specific. I really liked this warm color scheme, so I used several different reds, but I'm not going for matching the skin tone. Rather, I'm paying attention to the value and I'm really focusing on that. And this sums up mistake number 5, which is spending too much time rendering as a beginner and not enough time understanding facial structure and geometry. If you've been enjoying this video so far or you've learned something new, be sure to hit the like button. It's a great way to support the channel, and all it takes is one tiny little click. When I feel like I'm about done with a portrait, I do my final and most important step in the process. I put my materials down and I walk away. This space allows me to come back and look at my portrait with a fresh perspective. And if there's something that isn't sitting quite right, I commit to addressing it then. I don't say, oh, it's close enough and move on. Occasionally that's okay for quick layouts and practice, but when you're drawing a portrait and you're going for a likeness and you want your portrait to look like the person that you're drawing, you've got to nail it. I knew something was up and I asked my husband, I said, does this look like Scarlett Johansson? And he said, well, kind of, but maybe in the eyes and the nose, it's not quite right. And after looking at it, I figured it out. I knew what to do, but it was going to require moving some things on the portrait around, which can be really scary. But for me, it's worth it to go in and take these risks because it's taking a portrait from being just okay to being great. Here, when I fixed the eye, I actually removed it with a kneaded eraser and then came over it with an electric eraser. I really like this electric eraser. It works really well with colored pencil, and I will link that in the video description. Although the electric eraser is powerful and can remove the colored pencil in a way that a traditional eraser just doesn't, it won't remove everything. But this worked out in my favor here because I was able to see where the original eye was, and then I came in and tweaked it. I moved it up and changed the angle a little bit, and then I came in with some darker value so that I could eliminate and scrub out that first eye. I introduced this darker violet throughout the drawing, and that allowed me to push the value a little bit darker and to hide some of my mistakes and some of my alterations a little bit easier. Mistake number 6 is not being willing to fix mistakes when you notice them and write it off as being good enough. If you take this approach to your portraiture, you're never going to level up and get to that space where you are making really accurate, really confident portraits. Look at the differences between where my portrait ended up and where it was 45 minutes earlier. These little shifts and changes were completely worth it. And the way that you can start noticing these little tweaks that you can make in your portraiture is all through careful and intentional practice. The most influential practice that I have ever experienced was in the 100 Heads Challenge. I loved this challenge, and it did more than anything else to uplevel my portraits in the last decade. And you can check out that entire experience right here. I can't wait to see you there. Bye.